So this is a picture of me and my family as a child. And so my mother is Ethiopian and my father is American. And I just want to start by telling you a little bit more about where I come from and how that's influenced the story that I made. So I was born and raised in the inner city of Cleveland, Ohio, which is predominantly a Black African-American neighborhood. And then attended schools mostly in the attended private schools in mostly white affluent suburbs. And as a biracial Ethiopian American, this really influenced a lot of my thoughts about how identity was conceived and what home means as the daughter of an Ethiopian immigrant in the US. So I really felt this need to reconstruct my perspective of the world and impose that image back on the world to sort of set myself free from other people's projections of sort of their conception of my identity that was projected onto me, which is mainly projected by white people. So I just wanted to carve out some space for my culture and identity to exist unapologetically, which I see in and of itself as an intentional act of emancipatory thought and resistance to the reductive narratives of immigrants in the US and to the one-sided and unbalanced overall negative portraits of Africa that I saw in the media, in media representations. And I was just sort of tired of it all. So in short, I did this as an exercise in decolonial thought and to be the sole owner and author of the narrative of my identity. So moving on, here are some stills from the experience. And I'm just gonna go over a brief summary of what the experience is, and then I'll get into the trailer. So Farange is a visual dialogue between memory, reality, and the digital in an immersive memoir about Ethiopian American mixed race identity. And in the experience, you drift through some of my childhood memories from Cleveland to the streets of Piazza, Bole, Magananya, and Mercato in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And the point clouds essentially react in harmony with the narration, and each environment unfolds another layer of my understanding of my identity. So now I'm just going to show the trailer quickly.
Before I knew what it was, race and its divisions were embedded in my daily life. No one at school or at home looked like me. I can't say that I'm from here, but I can't say that I'm not either. What is home?
The first scene of the experience is set in Empress Aitu Ethiopian restaurant, which is, as I mentioned briefly, my parents' restaurant that I spent a lot of time growing up in as a child. And so my parents' restaurant is significant in the story for a few reasons. So one of them is that the namesake is the same as the Ethiopian empress who fought to preserve Ethiopia's independence from Italian colonial efforts in the Battle of Adwa. And so Empress Aitu herself is really an icon of resistance. And I've been reflecting on this more and more, especially after a few conversations with Sumaya, and actually gained a deeper understanding about the significance of the restaurant as an everyday space of resistance, because it really was an unofficial hub of Ethiopian culture in Cleveland, and that really wouldn't have existed otherwise. And as a result, it was the host of my cultural education and the only context in my life where I was readily perceived as both Ethiopian and American without question. So it was really important to me to document that and to preserve that in this experience. So my creative practice is rooted in this idea of emancipatory storytelling. And I'm defining that as representation without justifications. In other words, not having having an unapologetic tone and speaking directly to your own community without explaining elements of the story that you wouldn't necessarily explain at home, and making sure that this comes across in the actual delivery of the story. And when I was writing the script for Faranj, even though I had a lot of these things in mind, I realized that I still had a general tone of justification, because I really had this burden of explaining myself that was really deeply ingrained in me from years of basically, in though the predominantly white dominated spaces I was in, and people in those spaces making me feel like it was my responsibility to always justify elements of my culture to them. So I had to deliberately force myself to consciously unlearn the habit of always making white people feel comfortable. And the way that I got around this in the script was that I created an intentional subject object narrator viewer misalignment, so that when I say the word you, or when it sounds like I'm addressing the audience, I'm actually speaking to Empress Taitu. So it's really that was a narrative device where I was drawing on and celebrating Ethiopian history by including Taitu, the restaurant and the personification, as a way to basically shift the dialogue and make the conversation, make myself feel more comfortable and not feel like I'm explaining my story or justifying it when it doesn't need to be justified. It just needed to be expressed. So that's emancipatory storytelling. And moving on to the concept development in Faranj. So my background is in philosophy, and I had to start with the theoretical and conceptual groundwork from which I could then begin to build, to prototype a visual and spatial language for the story. So I asked myself, how do I define the concept of home from the context of living in diaspora? And what are the key elements of my day-to-day reality? And in my case in Cleveland, which I keep bringing up because there were so few Ethiopians who lived there, and we had a tiny community that was really dispersed across town. So, being in experience a lot of cultural alienation, which is this idea that you're basically, removed from your culture or can't really access it. And there was also double consciousness, which, in the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, is the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others and longing to attain self-consciousness and to merge this double self into a better and truer self. And also the experience of code switching, which is altering how you express yourself depending on the context of your surroundings. And an example of that would be that I knew that at school, people sort of shrugged it off whenever I spoke about Ethiopia or any element of Ethiopian culture or even the continent of Africa. And I learned through repetition that, okay, this is not something that people enjoy hearing about. So that I sort of developed a subconscious but automatic self-censorship and essentially silenced myself just to fit in at school. And the only space that I could be fully me was at home or at, once again, my parents' restaurant. So then I started thinking critically about my coping mechanisms in these scenarios. And one of them was that as I was struggling to make sense of this mixed race identity in these very racially segregated contexts, I started to adopt my mother's own, like her nostalgia for Ethiopia. I know this sounds pretty far out there, but I had a few memories of my own of traveling to Addis, but I basically just adopted my mom's nostalgia and things that I'd heard from stories from her and from other members of my family. And I developed a nuanced understanding of home as this imagined nostalgia that's evoked when listening to a subgenre of Ethio jazz. And there's a specific subgenre of Ethio jazz that has a distinctive pentatonic scale known as tizita, which also happens to mean nostalgia in Amharic. So then taking this back to the narrative, what does it mean to have this identity grounded in a constructed imaginary nostalgia that's both real and imagined? And so I said, well, I'm going to have to redefine what home means for this context. And traditional ideas of home refer to the specific geographic location in which one lives, but I propose that home can be rooted in a post-spatial experience that is extended within the non-spaces of music, history, language, culture, and time. So virtual reality then came into the picture as a technology that would allow me to literally and figuratively transport viewers to this digital imaginary that represented my reality. So that's the conceptual framework. And I'm going to now share the first scene. And it's in 360, so I'll click around. Sorry.
You were the soundtrack of my childhood.
Intrastate to Ethiopian restaurant. How may I help you? We don't serve rice. We eat injera, made with tape, like pancake. No.
There's a painting on your back wall that customers always ask about. I'd get so bored listening to my dad explain your history.
And of course, at the battle was Empress Taitu herself. She was a fierce leader, and she was a commander. She had 5,000 troops under her own command. She was in charge of the cannons. And of course,
when we first met, it was right next to my house. At the time, the only places in the world you existed were on St. Clair Avenue and in Piazza. What a combination, right? I'd go to you almost every day after school and sip on mango juice while doing homework at your bar with my dad, Carl. He's the white guy who just schooled you on Ethiopian history. You were so loud. You were my home. Being of two distinct cultures meant I was from both and neither. But you understood my pain. and I grew to admire your spirit of resistance. It reminds me of my mother's. After 12 years under.
Okay. Yeah, so what you saw was basically scene one, the restaurant scene. And now I'm gonna dive into the creative process and my choices around using photogrammetry, and how I built the visual and spatial language. So I was initially drawn to photogrammetry when I learned that this form of image processing doesn't actually capture mirrors, and its inability to reflect, to reconstruct reflective surfaces immediately struck me as poetically congruous to my own experience. And one of my internal struggles throughout life has been that no one seems to be able to recognize me as Abisha, Abisha meaning Ethiopian or Eritrean. And so it felt like in many cases I wasn't visible. And then in other cases, it would feel like I was really conspicuous. So visibility and invisibility was a really interesting and important theme for this project. And this technology's ability to, inability to reflect aligned with my story, as well as the sort of meta experience of visualizing identity, which is a really nebulous concept and difficult to portray. So yeah, so this is an image of one of the cooks in the restaurant. And I started actually asking friends and family to contribute videos of Cleveland and Addis for my creative exploration of what it means for home to be constructed immaterially via fragments of cultural and oral history distorted by the filter of time. So this scan was actually taken by the dishwasher at my parents' restaurant. And it was actually a really great and amazing experience to work with family, friends, and the restaurant staff to scan these little scenes. And so moving on, when I processed these images into 3D, I mean, obviously I had told people how to walk around, how to take videos so that, you know, so that it would make sense to process them, but it never really translated. And so people didn't, I drew charts, like walking paths, and showed them how to take these scans, but people, they just didn't, they never could follow them directly. So I ended up with these really irregular fragments that had missing pieces when I processed them. But I ended up really liking them, and I thought that they really do mimic the process of trying to remember, and memory is always in a state of fragmentation. So these fragments were, I put them together as like a curated collection of spatialized memories that united the visual with the conceptual. So in that way, that thing that happened along the way in the process was really beneficial to the overall project. And yeah, this is just another image of Addis. So going back to the idea of emancipatory storytelling, another way that I integrated that into the story is by centering my culture. And one of those ways is through food, but also through music, which you've heard a lot of in the samples that I just shared. So the songs in Ferenj are from the 60s and 70s in Ethiopia. And that was really regarded as the golden era of Ethiopian music, especially because this was right before the downfall of Emperor Haile Selassie and before the beginning of the brutal Mengistu dictatorship. So the years that followed are known as the Red Terror. And because of the horror that a lot of people endured, many Abishas are overcome with an overwhelming sentiment of nostalgia when listening to these songs that have now come to represent the years before. So I So there's a lot of layers of meaning that are that I've built into the world and the story structure that are meaningful to different audiences depending on their levels of exposure to Ethiopian culture or Cleveland or the restaurant itself. So conceptually then the user's experience, the viewer's experience really oscillates between exclusion and access to the built-in layers of meaning, because it's rare that one person has the same level of exposure to me, to each of these communities. Yeah, so moving forward, yeah, the different layers of meaning. And the audience does experience fragmented degrees of access to the story that I think are productive in this context. And it really does force viewers to lean a bit into discomfort and have this sense of fluctuating access and exclusion mirrors my own experience of growing up in these predominantly white environments. So that's mainly it. I have one more clip that I'm going to share. Here. This is the last scene in the story.
ማይታይ ነገር እንዴት ልግለጽ? I tried to laugh it off, but I felt the weight each time to eliminate everyone's doubt, but mostly my own. Maybe they were right? I wasn't born here. I can hardly read or write. I carry so much privilege with my foreign passing light skin and American passport. It is different. I can't say that I'm from here, but I can't say that I'm not either. What is home? I occupy multiple spaces at the same time. I see contradictions and I see inheritances. I see empire building, what has been collected and what doesn't add up. Race is a tool and it furthers the project of whiteness. I can't ignore the damage, my pain, but I do make it wasn't me who needed to become human. They needed to change their conception of it. As for you, I'm not quite sure what you are, but neither of us needs to explain ourselves. We are home.